As John said, my name is Daniel Hahn, and I'm delighted to have been the translator of this book of Juan Pablo's, which we're going to be talking about. I want to start with a kind of, I suppose, probably an obvious question about this book. For those of you who haven't read it, very briefly, the setup is, it's a young Mexican called Juan Pablo Villalobos, and we are going to go there in a second. It's called Juan Pablo Villalobos. He leaves Mexico, goes to Spain to do his doctorate, and gets involved in slightly weird gang machinations, which you'll hear about. The main character, Juan Pablo, he's Juan Pablo Villalobos. He's a Mexican writer. He's living in Spain. I don't want to ask that question about, is it really you? But you make it really hard not to ask that question. So I'd like to know what you're doing, and if you are mocking us by doing this.
Yes. Well, first of all, hello. Thank you, Daniel, and thanks to McNally Jackson for hosting this event. I would love to be in New York, but instead of being in New York, I'm here locked in my son's room. It's the best internet connection we have, so it's not New York, but it's okay. And yes, the truth is that it is a parody. It is a parody of autobiographical literature, which actually was the subject of my thesis when I studied Hispanic literature in Mexico. So I wrote a thesis on autobiographical literature.
Of course.
Yeah. So it was about memoirs and diaries and autobiographical novels. So I am not an expert, but I know a lot about these issues. And the novel is a parody of autofiction and autobiographical literature, and that's why the novel has 4 narrators. One of them is Juan Pablo, and Juan Pablo is writing an autobiographical novel. Then you have Valentina, which is Juan Pablo's girlfriend and then ex-girlfriend. And Valentina is writing a diary. And then Juan Pablo's mother and Juan Pablo's cousin, they are writing letters. So the whole structure, the narrative structure of the novel is taken from autobiographical literature, but the plot is fiction. I mean, everything is fiction. Just the starting point, I mean, some of the characteristics of Juan Pablo's character are mine. I mean, yes, as you said, he's Mexican, he's living in Mexico, and then he goes to live in Barcelona to make a PhD on literature. So, but that just the starting point. Then the whole plot is fiction. And that's why in the title in Spanish is No voy a pedirle a nadie que me crea, which literally would be, I'm
not going to ask anyone.
I'm not asking anyone to believe me, which is horrible. It's way better. I won't expect anyone to believe me. But it is because of in Rousseau's Confession, the French author Rousseau, in his autobiography, in the first page, he established the rules of autobiographical literature, when he writes something like, I'm going to tell the truth, all that you are going to read is true, and I'm asking you to believe me. So it's the promise of truth and asking the reader to believe. And this is why it's a parody. So the title is, I won't ask you to believe me.
The girlfriend, Valentina, the girlfriend who becomes the ex-girlfriend, has been studying memoir and biographical fiction, and she mentions Rousseau, and she mentions the autobiographical pact, which is I'm going to help you. And like 7 seconds later, she says, "By the way, I've been lying to you this whole time." Yeah. So it never the pact between the reader and the writer never lasts very long. Just when you think maybe, then it gets undermined very, very fast.
Yes, and actually, it's a parody, as I said, an auto parody, because I use my name, and I have to say that I have a funny story, because when I was writing the novel, at some point, I found out that the character of Juan Pablo's mother was becoming very ridiculous and disgusting, even disgusting. And at some point, I thought, I can do this to my mother, like, because if I use my name, Juan Pablo, and it's Juan Pablo's mother, I mean, at least in my family, my aunts and my sisters and brothers, etc., would think, well, this is our mother, this is Maria Elena. And I thought, I can do that. So then I changed the name of the protagonist. I remember that for a couple of weeks, maybe, I keep writing with the name of Gilberto. But obviously the whole auto parody, the whole parody of the autobiographical literature wouldn't work with a different name. So I need to use my name. And one day I just called my mom. I called her by Skype and I said, Mom, I need to tell you something. I need to ask you something. And she said something like, uh-huh. And I think that maybe she thought that I was going to say I'm going to divorce or something horrible about health or money. And I said, listen, I am writing a novel and it is fiction, but I'm using my name. And there is this character in the novel. There is Juan Pablo's mother. And the truth is that she's very racist and she's classist.
Yeah.
And she's a very disgusting person. But it's not you. I mean, it's because I'm playing with the auto. Imagine this conversation, me talking literary theory with my mother just to get the authorization to use her character in the book. And then after I explained the whole thing, I said, what do you think? And there was this silence. And she said, first she lied. She said something like, you know that I love everything you write. She said, yeah, come on. And after that she said, well, and the second thing she said, I think it was true. She said, this is what happened when you have a son that is a writer. and it is inevitable. I mean, even with my previous books, all the time, my relatives keep looking at the characters and saying, oh, this character is inspired in your brother, in your sister, this character is you, etc., etc. Imagine now using your name. And as you said, I put some of my biographical facts in Valentina, for example. And I mix my biography between Valentina and Juan Pablo. But even given that, many people said that Valentina was actually my ex-girlfriend. So this thing happens.
These things happen, but you're not. I mean, I'm trying to find a nice way of saying it's completely your fault that these things happen.
Yeah, of course.
You entirely created this problem for yourself. But there's a very lovely at the end in the acknowledgements. You apologize very sweetly to your mother in case anyone found this. But I rather like the idea that you call your mother and say, I've done this to you. I'm going to make everybody hate you in a book. And her reaction is kind of, I always knew this day would come.
Yeah, it's something like that. That I know. It was like, I know. You're a fucking writer. It's like that. and this is literally, you will use your mother if you can, just to get a new novel. And actually, there's a thing about the Juan Pablo's cousin too, and it is because that character, it is inspired by one of her cousins, and I have another funny story about that. That is the day that I presented the book in my city, in Guadalajara. That was in 2016 or 17. I was worried about my cousin coming to the presentation and saying something about, well, what are you doing? You know? And I was worried, and my brothers were saying like, he will come and he will go after you, etc., etc. And I was kind of worried, but he didn't come. But one of his brothers came, and then he was waiting for me to sign a book, and I was staring at him like saying, "Oh my God, he will say something, etc., etc." And then when he finally arrived to sign the book, he said to me something perfect, because that was the confirmation that all the things that I wrote in the novel were true. Because I would say to the readers, that the people who haven't read the novel, this character is a very, how do you describe it, Daniel? Very obsessed with business, and he's like very fantasious about getting rich and getting millionaire.
He's also sort of manic and slightly thought disordered as well. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. And then the brother of this cousin came and said, well, my brother, the one that was inspired in Lorenzo, said, my brother said to me that please ask you to forgive him because he couldn't make it. He couldn't come because he had a very important business meeting. So it was perfect because it was like the character, exactly like the character.
Exactly.
And actually, the whole story, the whole novel starts with a business meeting.
Yeah. Yes, the first line is something like, my cousin called me up and said, I've got some people I want you to meet. And it's set up. You mentioned, Juan Pablo, you mentioned the four narrators, Juan Pablo and Valentina and the cousin and the mother. But there's a huge array of extraordinary, colorful, and sometimes slightly monstrous characters. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the making of the characters in this book, because it seems to me that there's a game going on throughout this book with stereotypes, I guess. And the way I read it, and you can tell, this is how you don't do an interview. You don't just say what you think about but this is what I'm going to do anyway. The way I read it, these characters, there is Ahmed, there is a guy of Chinese heritage who is called the Chinaman, and there is a guy called Babe, and there are various characters of different ethnicities and sexualities and so forth. And none of them actually feel like stereotypes, except that everyone treats them like stereotypes. The narrators treat these actually quite interesting and rounded people as though they were stereotypes. Is that a fair depiction of what you're doing with the characters?
Yes, you described it perfectly. I mean, the idea was to work with the stereotypes, yes, and it's like the beginning of a joke, like you said. In Mexico, I don't know if in English it's the same, but in Mexico and in Spanish in general, we have the beginning of the joke of many jokes. It's like there was one day a Chinese, a Mexican, and a French guy, like enter to a bar, no?
Yeah.
And then it is like that. It is like if you have many characters from different ethnicities and different sexual conditions and origins, and you put them all together in the novel like an narrative experiment. And the truth is that it's very important for the novel that Valentina and Juan Pablo are writing at the moment of their arrival to Barcelona. I mean, it's the first time they are in the city. They are seeing and describing things like you do when you are living those things for the first time. This is very important because it's not the same when you write something after you live for a while or after you are almost an expert on that reality. And so the first view, the first time you see things, the first time you need to describe them, you frequently are just being very superficial, and you have to work with cliches. I mean, you have to build your perception of that new reality, interpreting with the things that you know from your previous experience, and that is your cliches, your stereotypes. What is a man like, or a Pakistani guy like, you know? And but the truth is that the difficult part was that those characters were actually not cliches, that they were real characters. But when they interact, each one of them treat the other like a cliche, something like that.
It's a very delicate balance getting that right, though. If you have, and in some cases we're talking about, there is some quite racist language, there are some quite racist attitudes, not only, you mentioned the mother, but not only the mother. There is, I mean, all the way through, including the narrators are victims of this. Valentina gets treated in certain ways because she happens to have dark skin. But I wonder if you found that a difficult, I guess, balancing act, to have the stereotypes, to have a lot of racism and racist language and prejudice, while nonetheless keeping the book, which I don't think is a racist book, and I don't think it has a racist message. Is that hard to square that?
Yeah, it is. And I think it is so difficult that maybe today I wouldn't do the same. I mean, the title of the first chapter, it's called, It Depends on Who's Telling the Joke. And I think that all that you described is very delicate, because it depends on the point of view. And this is, I'm asking the reader not to believe me, but I'm asking the reader to understand, or to understand who is telling each thing. I mean, it's not a racist book. You have to be alert on who's talking, who is describing, who is saying that. And that's why you can laugh at him, but not with him.
And
I don't know if you are laughing with a racist joke, you can laugh at the guy who's telling the joke, because you perceive that this guy is racist and he's stupid. Or you can laugh with him. I mean, you can laugh because you are a racist too. So this is very delicate, as you said. And this is, I am asking the reader to do that work. I mean, that is true.
There's a moment where one of the characters tells a joke, inspired by, so three people walk into the room and he sees a Mexican, a Chinese guy, and a Pakistani guy, and he thinks, that reminds me of the beginning of a joke, and he tells this joke. And nobody laughs at this joke. And the next 2 or 3 pages are basically them taking apart this thing. But I wonder what the fact that you're using humor, I think this is a very funny book. I really love the humor in it, as well as the humor that it's about. But I wonder whether the humor allows you to do things that you may not otherwise be able to do, or whether the humor actually somehow even raises the stakes and makes it even more difficult to get the tone exactly right when you're trying to portray racism and to portray cliches and portray stereotypes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say that I write humor, or something that pretends to be humorous, because that's the literature I like. I mean, it's not, I don't have the pretension to create in the first instance, I mean, to create some critical social critics of the reality in Mexico or in Spain using humor. I mean, I just can't not do it. I mean, it's like that. It's the literature I like. It's what I like to read. So after that, it's true that I'm all the time in all my books, since Down the Rabbit Hole, then Quesadillas, then I Will Sell You a Dog, the whole time I was dealing with very delicate issues. In Down the Rabbit Hole, it was drug trafficking and violence. in Quesadillas was poverty, injustice, inequity. In I Will Sell You a Dog, it was about memory and about how we in Mexico have been building this idea of our identity and of our memory, ignoring a lot of the people of the country who are totally forgotten and marginalized. And in this, and I won't expect anyone to believe me, it is about violence too. It is about racism, and I know that it's hard to deal with these issues, and that is even dangerous. I will say dangerous, because I have to admit that sometimes in social media or in some presentations, when I chat with someone, I realize that that particular reader was actually laughing with the jokes that I was pretending to be a critic of something, and that actually he was like just laughing because it was funny. Like, for example, the jokes of the mother, of Juan Pablo's mother. I mean, you can laugh with her if you are classist and racist. Mm. And sometimes it happens, and it frightens me, actually. It's like, I don't know. I have to be responsible for that. I mean, because I write the book, and it's my book.
Yeah,
it's my responsibility.
I suppose it's also an interesting experience for a reader to find yourself sort of seduced by these voices, because even though these are not all characters you would love in the real world, the voices are very strong and they're very seductive, and they're mostly very funny and they're quite energetic, and you find yourself sort of being seduced by these characters, and you catch yourself going, I can't believe I'm even considering laughing at the thing this person said, because they said something actually monstrous.
Yeah,
there is a sort of a really, again, it's quite high risk, but there's a possible kind of complicity if you're a reader with a book in which a lot of the characters are expressing the views which I'm sure I don't agree with.
Yeah. Can I quote a French philosopher?
Yeah, go on. Just one.
Just one? Okay. Henri Bergson, sorry, my French, he wrote something, he wrote a book on humor. And he wrote there that, a quote, it's like, there's nothing worse than to laugh alone by yourself. And that quote kept with me for a while, like, and I was thinking about a lot, and I said, no, there's something worse. Is to laugh in bad company. I mean, if you are laughing with the racists, if you are laughing with the classists. And I was very aware of that when I was writing this book. And I know it was risky and it was even dangerous, maybe. But literature is about this. I mean, it's not about feeling and being comfortable writing. I mean, it is about sometimes experiment with the limits. And I have to say that my next book, I mean, that it was out in Spanish a couple of months ago, in a very perfect time for quarantine. It's very different because it's like a B-side of I Won't Expect Anyone to Believe Me. It's maybe because in between I Won't Expect Anyone to Believe Me and my new book, I wrote a nonfiction book on minor immigrants, a book of testimonies, and it's a very it was a very hard experience. It was tough to write that book, and that, I think, that made me realize that I had a responsibility with the way I was writing and the effects that my writing could create and could provoke in readers.
Mm.
And maybe it's not a serious book. I mean, it's humorous in a different way, but maybe it's more responsible. I don't know. It's not, actually, it's not, but it's different. It's different because I had that feeling when I finished. I won't expect anyone to believe me, that I was playing with the limits.
Mm. You said something when you were talking about humor a couple of minutes ago. You said writers who use humor are the writers you like. They're the writers you kind of like to read. And I'm curious to know whether you can say something about the other writers whose fingerprints are on this book. The book is full of writers being name checked. There are some like Ibargüengoitia and like Bolaño who are mentioned many times. But almost every page feels like it's got a reference to somebody. And I wonder whether you can say something about the relationship of this kind of all of your reading and how they end up being woven into this book.
Yeah, there's 3 very important influences in the writing of this book. The first one is a Catalan writer called Pere Caldés. Pere is Peter in Catalan. So he lived in Mexico for more than 20 years. He was exiled after the Civil War in Spain. And he wrote 2 or 3 books when he was living in Mexico about Mexican reality. And it's very funny because he wrote them in Catalan. And at some point when he came back to Barcelona and those books were published, some of the Catalan exile accused him of being racist. And so he wrote an afterwards, I think, or it was a prologue, I don't remember, in one of the books, like to answer those accusations, saying that he was not a racist and that he appreciates Mexicans, etc., etc. And when I read that text, I thought that I could write a novel like a response to that letter. And actually, there's an epigraph in the book, in the first page, that is from Pere Caldés, saying that Mexicans are very nice and they live in Barcelona. They don't cause any problems, and I wouldn't expect them to write about Barcelona, saying that Barcelona is beautiful and that everything is right here. And I said, yeah, well, let's write a book about how Barcelona can be an awful place to live, like Pere Caldés write about Mexico, you know. And then the second writer is obviously Sergio Pitol. Pitol, a Mexican writer, lived in Jalapa his last years, and I studied at Jalapa literature, and I met him. And during the 90s and the first years of the 21st century, was one of my favorite writers, and I read him devotedly. And he lived in Barcelona for a while. And in one of his books, he has this diary called El Diario de Escudillers, Escudillers Diary. Escudillers is a street in the Raval neighborhood in Barcelona, in the center of Barcelona. And I remember that I had problems with Valentina, with Valentina's diaries, and I wasn't satisfied with the narrative tone and with the voice of Valentina. And one of those days, I read the Escudillers diaries of Sergio Pitol, and even like if I was doing an exercise, I started to like imitate the diary with Valentina's. And I picked some sentences from Pitol's diary, and I put them on Valentina's diary. And at the end, it happened that the whole diary of Valentina was that. I mean, it's inspired by those 20 pages of Pitol's diary. So it was a very, very important influence on this novel. And the third is Bolaño. Bolaño, and it's not an influence like Calders or Pitol. It's more subtle. It's because my thing with Bolaño is not about style or subjects or a very strong literary influence. It is about how Bolaño built for us, I mean us, the writers that live expatriate outside our homelands, the authors who have been living for many years abroad, how Bolaño solved a very important problem about the place for us. The place, I mean, from which place do we write? I mean, you need a place to settle and to write, and it is a linguistic place, because Spanish, and we should talk about that, there's not just one Spanish. We have Mexican Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, it's Catalan Spanish, etc., etc. And for Bolaño, it was a problem, and for me, it was a problem too, that after many years living outside Mexico, I wasn't comfortable pretending to be a Mexican author. I mean, I wasn't just a Mexican author. I mean, I wrote 3 books, 3 novels that are completely Mexicans. I mean, they are Mexicans because they are written in Mexican Spanish. They are about Mexican subjects and issues, and the characters are Mexicans. And 10 years later, I felt, when I finished writing I Will Sell You a Dog, the 3rd one, I felt that I was starting to being false. I mean, that I was like pretending to be Mexican, because my whole experience, my whole relation with Mexico was very distant. I was living in Brazil at that time, so it was even harder because I was speaking Portuguese the whole time. So the Portuguese syntax and vocabulary was starting to mess with my Spanish. And I had this terrible crisis about who am I in terms of narrative voice. I mean, which is my vocabulary, my syntax, etc. And Bolaño, something similar happened to Bolaño. He lived for many years in Mexico, and then he lived in Catalonia too. And if you read Bolaño, you can see that Bolaño is writing in nowhere Spanish. I mean, he's not writing in Chilean Spanish, neither in Mexican Spanish. When he tried, he failed.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's something interesting that happens in this book then, because if you talk about how your Spanish may be changed in this time, and your Spanish is presumably porous because you're living with different other Spanishes. What's interesting though is that this book doesn't exactly resolve that. It almost does the opposite, because it keeps very clearly there are Mexican characters, there are Argentine characters, there are Catalan characters, there are Spanish characters, and these Spanishes are all in the book very clearly, and there's a lot of talk about the differences between them, but they're not resolved into, there isn't a kind of happy resolved global Spanish in here. What you have is these little pockets of a very Argentine Spanish and a very Spain Spanish and a very Mexican Spanish.
It was like my solution on that novel, that it was not permanent. I mean, it just was useful for this book, was that I want to talk and write all the Spanishes. I mean, it was like an omnivorous solution. I want to be Mexican, and I want to be Argentinian, and I want to be Colombian and Peruvian, and even Italian, Pakistani, etc. And but I don't know why. The fact that all these registers of Spanish were like interacting in the novel made it easier for me. I mean, what was impossible for me was just to write in Mexican Spanish.
I'm glad it made it easier for you, because I want to be absolutely clear. It did not make it easy.
Yes.
I want to ask you a question about translation. We also we've already been on for about 40 minutes, and we have a few questions coming in the chat. And a couple of the questions on the chat are actually about the experience of being translated.
I thought about my hair. Questions about my hair.
Yeah, also well, that someone very wisely asked if it's true that you've run out of mezcal. This is a very important question. But I want to ask a translation question first. We can come to that one afterwards. The translation, one of the things that really interests me, this is the only book we've done together. Juan Pablo, for those of you who don't know, is normally translated by Rosalind Harvey, who's a brilliant translator from Spanish. But my experience of translating this was incredibly pleasurable for lots of reasons, but it was also great working with a writer who understands what translation is about, and who is generous, and who is helpful, and so forth. And I wonder if you can say something, since you have, not everyone will know that you also work with a translator yourself, whether being a translator changes the way you think about having translation perpetrated on you rather than being the perpetrator of the translation. Whether you think of the experience of being translated maybe differently because you've been put through the kind of things that you are now putting everyone else through.
Well, the truth is that I believe that translators are writers. I mean, for me, it's like that. And to translate is to write. It's similar of what happens when you're a novelist and you suddenly accept to write a nonfiction book. it's because your creative freedom, it's not the same. I mean, you have to respect. In the case, the translator has to respect the original, but at the same time, it's not just about choosing the right words. No, there's a lot of creative decisions that a translator needs to do in order to translate the book, and the result, for me, it's a totally different book. It's a version of the book. And I really believe that. And you know that we made some changes in the book. So it is a different version. And it was even more radical in I Will Sell You a Dog, my previous book, because we made something that actually changed the book. Because on that book, there was this group of old men and ladies living together in this old building. And one of the occupations that they have is a reading group. So they have a reading group, and they are reading a Mexican novel. In my version, in the original version, they are reading a Mexican novel called Palinuro de México by Fernando del Paso, which is a huge book. It's a heavy book. It's like a 600 pages book, and even the edition that they are reading, it comes with another novel, so it's a 1,000 page book. And the only well, obviously I love the book, and that's why the book is in the novel, but actually the reason why I picked that book is because it is heavy. It's a huge book, and at some point in the novel it will be used as a weapon. And I thought,
the reader doesn't know what that is.
Yeah, and then I thought that the international readers will think that Palinuro de Mexico, what's Palinuro de Mexico? This novel is not for me. This novel is for people who understand and know Mexican culture and literature. And it wasn't like that. I mean, it was just a heavy and big book. So I remember that I had this conversation with Rosalind, and and I proposed her to change the title of the book and to pick an international and very well-known book. So we decided to change it to a compiled edition of the 7 books of the In Search of the Lost Time of Marcel Proust. But what really was funny was that when we need to change something, not just the title of the book, we need to change some dialogues. And at some point of the novel, the books are lost, and because someone steal the books, and then there's this dialogue saying like, "Get me back my palinuros," and in the new version, it's "Get me back my lost time." And it's nice, it's beautiful, because the book is about that. It's about being old and being frustrated, and about the time that you left. And it was so perfect that I even thought, why I didn't think that 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And I had to say that I will propose to my Spanish editor, to my publisher, to change it in the next edition. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned and you mentioned Bolaño, and there is a point. Valentina's reading Savage Detectives in this, and there is a point when she fantasizes about using it as a weapon, and she fantasizes about hitting Juan Pablo on the head with it, and she says something like, "It's unfortunately I only have the paper bag, but I imagine if I got a bit of momentum behind it, I could probably do some damage with it."
Yes, yes, I have something with using books as a weapon.
It's very natural. I think a lot of writers feel that way. There's a question, Juan Pablo, a question from Alejandro about the next project. And actually, I wonder if you can say something about the book, just briefly, the book that you've just published. You mentioned a little bit about it, but also what you're working on now. I don't know, are you able to work in quarantine? Are you managing to do work in lockdown, or is it just not a condition for you?
Well, the truth is that I finished my new novel last year, on May, a year ago, and I usually live like a year or something like that to start thinking and creating my new novel, but not writing. I mean, just thinking, and reading things that I feel that can give me the tone or ideas for the book. So I'm now on that process. So the quarantine for me didn't stop me for writing. I mean, I wasn't writing, and I didn't pretend to write right now, so it's okay. And see, my new novel, and actually it will be published in English by And Other Stories too. So they already bought the rights, so it will be out in English maybe in a couple of years or something like that. It's very different because
I can see 2 And Other Stories people who are sort of vaguely nodding. We have some waving. Yes, there we are.
So it's different because the linguistic solution, for example, is the opposite. So it is a book written in a very strange language. I mean, it doesn't uses the words we know. I mean, for example, to the whole thing about nationalities in the novel, because it is about racism, it is about multicultural issues, but in the novel, there's this narrator, which is a very strange narrator. It is in a third person narrator, but at the same time, he or she or it uses the first person, the plural first person. So he said we. He said something like, "Now we see that the character goes, etc., etc." Right. And he named he doesn't name the nationalities. He uses he uses just geographical references. He says, for example, cono sureño. How do you translate cono sureño from the cono sur?
Yeah.
Yeah, or he said septentrional, or the Chinese guys are lejano orientales, far orientals.
Far East, yeah.
Yeah. So and there's this this strategy of not naming things and using a strange language. So it's the opposite solution than in I Won't Expect Anyone to Believe Me. And it is about one of the subjects that I'm really fascinated with, that is extraterrestrial life. It is about aliens, and it has something of dystopia and science fiction. So it is a different book, yes.
There's a related question from Luca in Barcelona who's asking about creating a new language, as you say. What are the main features or the tricks or the elements that characterize the creation of language in this novel?
Well, actually, in I Won't Expect Anyone to Believe Me, I would say that it is about a lot about cliché, what we talk. I mean, a lot about the how the reader can recognize very easily the way the characters speak and the way the characters write. And in the new one is the opposite. There's the idea is that when you're reading, you have some kind of strange feeling and like a distance, like what's happening here. So it's very different. And my belief is that if you don't do something with language, you are not doing literature. I mean, literature is about language. It's not about the plot. It's not about the content of the book. I'm not afraid about spoiling things or whatever. I mean, literature is not about that. Literature is about what you do with language. And that's why translations are so important. I mean, good translations, because it's not just about the reader in French or in English or in German can understand the plot that you wrote. No, it is about getting to another language, to French, to German, some spirit of the book, some of the thing that you create with the language. So it's tricky and it's very, very difficult.
You said that you're in the stage now of reading for the next thing. And actually, there's a question from Tanya who wants to know what you're reading now. So what are the things that you're reading that may seep in somehow into whatever comes next?
Yes, I'm reading about happiness. It's something that comes from my new novel, that it started with that, like a reflection on why all the time we are writing and creating around violent and sad and terrible and hurting subjects. And there's this very famous quote, I think it was Tolstoy, who said, like, it's impossible to write good literature of happiness, and all the happy families are the same. And I don't know, I think that we should fight with that, because I don't know, maybe I'm being naive, but I really would like to think that there's a different way of writing around, I don't know if good feelings, but about the idea of, or the possibility of happiness. So I'm obsessed with that now. And I'm reading some philosophy and some essays and also novels, obviously, around the idea of happiness.
I'm going to ask you one last question. Actually, we're almost at an hour now. And there are lots of things I wanted to ask you. And we talked about maybe doing a reading. We have so many things you wanted to do in this hour. We didn't have time. I'm going to ask you one last thing, which sort of spins off what you were saying about how you, I suppose, the feelings that you convey, the sort of tone of a book. And I wanted to ask you about the ending of I Don't Expect Anyone to Believe Me. While I accept that it's not about plot, I am nonetheless not going to give away the ending of the plot. We're going to pretend that plot is important, and I'm not going to say how it ends. I want
Okay.
but I want to say something about the writing of the ending of this book, not from a spoilery, plotty point of view, but from a tonal point of view, because I think one of the things that I think is amazing in this book is a very clever and very subtle and very delicate thing that happens to the tone at the end and leaves the reader with a really particular feeling. And I wonder whether you were writing towards that. So not, did you know how it was going to end, but did you know how tonally how this book was going to end?
Yes. Well, I have to say that it's very frustrating that I can't talk of a couple of things that I really, really was very interested in when I was writing this novel, because it could become it could spoil the reading. And one is a technical thing, and it is about the use of, how do you say, ellipsis?
Ellipsis.
Ellipsis. Oh,
yeah.
Easy. And it is about because the whole novel, it is about, technically, in terms of writing, it is about the use of ellipses. How do you create narrative tension, and how can you take that to the limit? The ellipses. And the other thing is the original idea of the novel was that it would be a novel that I don't know if I should say that, that it will be impossible to continue because it would be losing the narrators. So that was from the beginning. That was my idea. That was the in the beginning. It wasn't just that somehow at some point I decided. No, the idea was that. So it has to do with something that happened to me, like in 2013 or 12, when McSweeney's, the magazine, published an issue on Latin American crime fiction, and asked for a group of writers to write a short story about the Latin American reality. And the idea was how you can write crime fiction in Latin America today. That was the premise. And when they asked me to do that, I kept thinking about Mexico. I was living in Brazil, and I arrived to the conclusion that because of the Mexican reality, violence, the corruption, the total failure of the justice instances, that it would be impossible to write conventional crime fiction. That the only solution was to write it badly. You wouldn't know if something was true or not, who was saying the truth and who was lying. You never know, because we never know. We never know. When something horrible happens in Mexico, we never know what really happened. Who was responsible? Who are the bad guys? We never know. Or we know, but they don't they are not judged. So I wrote this short story where the whole time the plot is changing because no one knows what's happening, and at the end it's all just like a pile of lies, you know. It is just like a mountain of lies. And I thought that this was the starting point of, I won't expect anyone to believe me. I mean, the idea of how can we write about Mexico today? And there was the answer was, it's impossible. And that's why, I won't spoil the plot, but that's why the novel is kind of interrupted.
I have many other things I want to ask, but it is. I was going to say it's 7 o'clock. It's 7 o'clock for some of us. It could be anything for some of you. But it is close to the hour wherever you are.